So since I was a very small child, people have asked me the age-old question, what are you? I am a poet. The poet Audre Lorde said, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would have been crushed into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. And this is very much what my poems do for me. You could be so pretty if you would just do this one thing. If you would just do this one thing. If you would just get in your place. Get in your place, Suzi Q. I saved it for you. Get in your lane, Suzi Q. You are too big for your britches, but you can hide in my bed. I made it for you. Get in your place, Suzi Q. You should be more grateful. Some people don't even know where their place is. I saved this space for you. Maybe you should cover some of that up, Suzi Q. Or maybe you should show it all. Or maybe you should shake it, girl. Maybe you should shake it. I don't want it though, but you should want me to, and I might if you try sometimes. And what kind of name is that anyway, Suzi Q? Is that some kind of cultural thing? And did that come from your mother's people? And what kind of people are they anyway? And what kind of people are you? And what are you, Suzi Q? Who told you that you do not need permission to speak? Who are you to use words like that? How dare your mouth be so big and not smiling? And maybe you should be more quiet, and maybe you should whisper in my ear first before you speak out loud, Suzi. Everyone can tell you don't belong here. And if your feet were not so big, Suzi, and if you were not so black, Suzi, or if you could just be black enough, or maybe if your hips could narrow and your lips tuck in, if your hair could be more polite, if your face would just apologize, always arguing with itself so publicly, if you could just be pretty in a way that doesn't scare me. And why you always got to scare me, Suzi, and why do you spill over all of the cups and be so impossible to fold into boxes? And where is the cage that can contain the inferno of your ideas? And why is your mouth on fire, Suzi? Why is your mouth always on fire? If you could be more, if you could be more simple, if you could be less black hole, if you could suck yourself in and swallow without taking all of us with you, we could forgive you, Suzi. We could forgive you.
Hey everybody, welcome to Blended Conversations. I am your host, Eccentric, and thank you for joining us. As always, Blended is a platform where we speak to the artists and we learn who they are, the people behind the art that we love, and how they bridge who we are as people. Blended Conversations basically allows us to find out we are a lot more alike than we think, and we use the art to prove it. So today, we have a very special guest joining us from Denver, Colorado. And I always allow my guests to introduce themselves because it's their stories to tell. And so join me in welcoming Suzi Q. Smith. How are you, Suzi?
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Eccentric. It's so nice to see you during this time when normally we could have been together at the Women of the World Poetry Slam this
I'm
time,
telling
years
you.
ago, 4 years ago, once upon a time, right?
Long
So
time.
I'm happy to see you here and now. It's good to see your face. I'm Suzi Q. Smith. I live in Denver, Colorado. I am an artist, activist, educator, are the three titles that usually intersect with the work that I do in the world. And I'm a mother to a one grown daughter.
Just one and done, huh?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Smart lady. I got 5 now.
Yeah, five. That's luck too, though. That's beautiful.
Yeah, man. All right. So the artist, the educator, and the activist. I can get with that. I think that's a nice lead into our first question. You've introduced yourself. Now let's get into it. So why arts and activism? How do they intersect? Why use them together to create change?
I cannot help it. I think they both get born out of the same thing for me, right? They all are part of the same work. So I started my career, I was 18 when I started working for a civil rights organization, but I've been writing poems for much longer than that. So I've been writing poems since I was a small child, going to open mics and readings and whatever, any place you could read a poem for people, I was there from the time I was in high school and ever since. So that's been part of my process. And a lot of it just comes from being a deep feeler, right? I feel things too deeply to contain in my body. I feel things too deeply to let them ride. I feel too deeply to exist in a world without expressing how I respond to it, how it impacts me, how it impacts other people. Just a deep, deep commitment to equity, justice, right?
Mm,
Um, and so art comes from that same place, right? Art and like the need to move, the need to do something, the need to respond to it, right? The need to correct, the need to adjust, whatever it is. because I can't just like not observe things, and I can't not feel things. And I feel things so much that I can't contain them inside my body. So they explode into some form of movement. And that includes poetry.
Wow, I think when I hear the word equity, I get so excited because we don't hear it enough, in my opinion. We always hear equality, 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 but we never talk about equity. And it's so important to understand the difference between the two. And what I find when I'm participating in art, whether I'm the main attraction, right? Or whether I'm just viewing art is, I think it creates a balanced feel because everybody looks at the same work of art or hears the same work of art, but they're gonna process it completely different based on their experiences or their perceptions or the things they've encountered. And I think art is the great equity of things. You start with the same thing and then you start branching out to those different things, bridging that gap between who we are, right? So I thought that was very interesting. I love that you used that word.
Thank you. And I feel the same way. I use that all the time when I'm describing people's relationships. Sometimes we get mad at our art, we get mad at our poems, and I say, well, like, but again, people receive it differently based on where they are, right? Like, so my favorite song might have been like, oh, I was in high school and this thing happened. I remember this, and I was with my friends, da da da. I have my relationship with the song. Maybe for you, you heard that song played at a funeral, and you have a very different relationship with that song, right? The song didn't do anything wrong. The song is just the song, right?
The song is the song.
We hear it differently. We receive it differently. We have different relationships, which is why it's so important to like be able to kind of separate. I have to separate myself from poems sometimes and go like, oh, if you heard when I said that, that's not how I meant it, but that's all right. You received it from where you were. And also it's not, and everyone's not going to receive it the same way, but it doesn't necessarily change the quality of the work, right? It doesn't mean
absolutely not.
Right? It just means like, oh, that's interesting to me now. Just more of like interesting, engaging conversations about how people feel about it and go like, oh, that's curious.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's definitely, I was telling somebody, once you create something and you share it with the world, it almost no longer becomes yours because it's gonna morph. It morphs into its own being.
I mean, look, I'm a mother of an adult daughter, right? Like, she is her own person now. Like, I made my body. However, and I still got a lot to do with her. She's still my baby, but at the same time, she's her own person, right? She still goes out in the world without me and like has a job and, friends.
You're like, what is this? You don't need me? You don't need me?
So yeah, she has a life of her own. So, she started with me, but she's her own person.
That is a word. It starts with us, but it does not finish here. And I think that's the beauty of the arts for sure, which is a great segue into us viewing your first poem. I'm always so excited to share pieces of the artist so that the audience can chime in when they're watching and we can see how they react to the poem. So if you're watching, we hope you enjoy it. We hope you take something from it. Check out Suzi Q's poem.
I wish I knew what to say. I've been so ashamed. This begging heart that I would not claim kicked it hard in front of company when it came in loud and stumbling, knowing I can't afford to look weak, all empty hands and dirty feet, and some working knowledge of when and how to unstone a heart or pull a thorn from a crown, and now deciding whether I want to or how to weather. Sometimes leather is the only way to live when there's little left for the well to give except advice that I don't know how to take, so I'm wondering how many bones to break, wonder if I can regenerate, deciding whether I want to. Feel like these are some known shoes. I'm stumbling down an old path. Realize a labyrinth is just basic math, and growth happens in spirals too. This vortex of cycles thought I overflew. I reached for the sun, the ocean still got her due, and maybe it's true that I love you, and maybe we'll call this a breakthrough, but I suspect your breath on my neck is yet another intoxicant. I suppose you make me dizzy. I propose that we get busy, pretending we don't have names. Sometimes I practice forgetting your face. Picture mine in its place. Say, pulse, don't race. I brace myself for you not to stay. Make believe it was always this way. Me, humbled in prayer, prostrate. I find new ways to show devotion to the divine sobriety of my solitude. You might be God and I'm holy too, and maybe this ain't about you but me. You, the shard stuck I don't want to see. I say, how else do you tame an ocean? But with a mirrored moon frozen, a magnet of some magnitude to mute an ill-conforming mood, or woman in a state of vapor,
whose self-defense is second nature, and maybe all trust is reckless, and maybe this love is preface to a story I already epilogued. Maybe all my conversations are monologues. Maybe we are all gods. Maybe we are all God.
I think now, are you originally from Denver?
I am.
Okay, so let's talk about Denver and your favorite tradition. I guess we could go in your family, or if it's something that Denver does that's amazing to you, you can share that as well.
Absolutely. So it's a little bit of both. So my family's not originally from here, but I was born in Denver, Colorado. My father is from Kansas City, and so all of my people have been in Quindaro, Kansas since for quite a long time, for many generations. So my father moved here when he was in high school with my grandmother. They moved here into Denver, Colorado, and then my mother's family is from the San Luis Valley, which is in southern Colorado, and then my mother moved here for nursing school. So anyway, Denver has been a part of my life this whole time, but we have journeys getting here, right? So Denver is like known as a transplant city, right? Most people in Denver are not from Denver. It's a very common place for people to move to.
Okay, didn't know that.
Yes, we're a very growing city. So when you say you're from Denver, people are like, what? Who? Where? There's
That's
only
like
like
when they say we're from Florida. 'Cause I didn't know that Denver was the same. When I say I'm a native to Florida, they're like, what?
Yeah, what? No, this is a place where you migrate to. It's not a place where you start. So
Okay.
this is the place where I have started. And I don't know that I look like the people that when you think of Denver, Colorado, or Colorado in general, I don't know that I look like what people expect, what you picture when you think of Colorado. Not what I picture in Colorado. I definitely don't fit the stereotype of, the Colorado ski bunny and
And the lumberjack.
I don't do either of those things. At the same time, my brother is literally a lumberjack, right? He has
She's like, no, quite literally.
yeah, like no, I mean, he's a black lumberjack with he's got a tree removal company, and he's out there with his
Wow.
taking down trees. And we're about to have a storm that hits tomorrow, and I've got plenty of firewood because my brother is a lumberjack for real. so,
Wow.
so we don't look like the Coloradoans that people might expect, and yet we are, right? We grew up, amidst these mountains and etc. Really in the city though. And so it's been an interesting journey, but also arts is part of my family. Like my great grandfather was a poet, right? And I was raised by my grandmother, so I was raised in that tradition very strongly. Her father was a poet, and of course,
Wow.
being black, 1890, he was born in 1895 in Kansas City. He was not part of the Harlem Renaissance because he was in Kansas, and he was, and he was raising 11 children, but he wrote poems all the way through. And also, like when I think about my life, and I never knew him, he died before I was born, but my grandmother laughs when she hears me talk about like coaching poetry performance. Like I've coached kids for like poetry out loud, but also coaching in slam for many years. And she says that's something that her father used to do just at home, right? They were at home, no TV. You know what I mean? It's the Great Depression.
Wow.
At home, and recitation of poetry was one of the ways they kept themselves and each other entertained. It was normal to memorize poems and recite poems around the table in front of the fire, right? That was something that they did. So it's something that I've grown up doing. It's not at all unusual to be able to say like, Aunt Sheila, will you please read that Paul Laurence Dunbar poem, right? And it's just like off the dome, she'll have it, right? This is
Wow.
normal kind of thing that we do in my family. So it's not unusual. So part of that's part of my own family's tradition, right? When it comes to Denver, I think some beautiful things about it are that, growing up, it was a much smaller city when I was growing up here. The population has boomed significantly, but because it was a smaller city, there was sort of this subset of artists, right? And because it was small enough, like we don't quite have 6 degrees of separation, it was more like 3. And so everybody knows everybody. We collaborate, we work together because we have to, right? There's not enough resources, right? There wasn't enough support for everybody to be popping, doing a million different things. There's enough for us to all kind of build a collective space where we're exploring and creating together. And there weren't a lot of eyes on us and there weren't a lot of rules. It was just us together in these little artist collectives. So you found a lot of people, and also it's small enough still that you can do almost any type of art that you want. If I decided, next week that like, you know what, I want to do like an opera, jazz, metal tap show, I probably could make phone calls and it would be a thing. Like, okay, let's go. It's only be 12 people in the audience, but you know what I mean? Like it's possible to make those things happen in a city of this size. Now, granted, it's grown a lot, but I do have a lot of relationships here. And so that's a beautiful thing to still have that sense of community and connection, because I think that was the only way to really make things possible. So there is that sort of people power,
Yeah,
because those communities of care have been the only way that any of us have gotten through, right? Because it's been so necessary. So it's a
yes.
lifestyle in a lot of ways, right? So this community of like the healers and, all the hippie homies and all the,
Uh-huh.
and especially for Black people in Denver, because our population is so small. We used to have Black neighborhoods in Denver when I was growing up, right?
Okay.
We don't now. Gentrification is so strong that we're very, very dispersed. And so we have to be really, really intentional now about being in community and reaching each other and finding each other and creating spaces to be together. So it makes that relationship that much more sacred, that much more precious, right? It makes it that much deeper, like when you are somewhere and you haven't seen any Black people for days, and
Yeah.
you look like, hello, friend.
Hello, friend.
Hi, stranger, let's be friends right now. Like, there is, there's a stronger sense of community when it's so sparse.
Wow, that's so interesting to hear. I mean, I'm born and raised here in Pompano. We are 106,000 total. We have 2 exits. So we're relatively, not relatively, we're small. I live in a Northwest community here, and I can go days without seeing white people. And it's so, yeah, and it's so interesting. I live in a single family home in a predominantly working class African American community. But it's changing. We're seeing Spanish people show up. I saw, a white lady walking her baby the other day, and it's so strange. And I'm like, what is happening? And a lot of the developers are buying the houses and renting them out. And
Mm,
so this is how our community is changing. And so what we do here, our art scene is big for the size of our city. We're still growing, obviously. But what I do here is to infuse the arts in the African American communities, because for so long they didn't exist. I mean, to hear you talk about growing up with poetry is something to be desired. Um, that was not my experience at all. I mean, I think I wrote my mom for Mother's Day. I wrote her this poem book that my teacher helped me laminate. She was great. And that was like my first book, and my mom still has this book. When I wrote my first fiction novel, she pulls it out. She was like, "Oh, I have your first book." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she pulls out this book, and I'm like, "Holy cow, you still have this." So it's amazing to hear you talk about that. And then as you find out more about your family, I didn't know my biological father, but as I found out more about him, turns out he's a writer and he's a poet and he sings and he's all these things that I am. And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So I think that's so interesting that the arts are well rooted in your family. And I think uh, that speaks a lot to the longevity of the arts and the arts abilities to, like you said, find people that you don't see and bring them together. You're like, yeah, we're friends now. We're going to go to the show and we're going to be a collective because this is what we have and this is how we can express what we have.
right. And I think in Denver too, we have there's a lot of different communities here. And again, like we all come together in different ways, right? So like when you think about like the poets out of Denver, there's a whole cross section, right? We are Black and brown and white and punk rock and all type of everything and hip hop and all of these things mixed together. Because again, like anyone who's like sort of on the margins, on the fringes at all, like we gather together and just be like, yep, we go together, all of us, all of us at the same time.
At the
And
same time.
it's been a beautiful space to be like, to build this really, really inclusive bubble of all types of different people, right? And I think that our poetry scene has allowed us to do that for sure and build some really, incredible relationships with people who we might not have naturally been drawn to, right? But when you have that need for each other, right? Like, because otherwise it's going to be just 2 of us reading poems in a room to each other, which is cool. But you want to start really building community, right? You've got to start connecting to folks who are not like you. And so we've done a lot of that in Denver. Just a lot of it was out of necessity. And then now it's out of desire, right? We like each
Yes.
other, even love each other deeply, right? So that matters. And that's given us a lot of creativity and a lot of space around that, right? And again, also thinking about space and creativity, right? Because gentrification is real. So holding on to venues has been incredibly challenging in a city that gets gentrified, right? The home where Slam Nuba lived for over 10 years, Crossroads Theater, right? Is now an office space, right? There have been so many, this happens over and over again with so many of our spaces. that don't get to be our spaces anymore. So we have to get creative around venues and trying to figure it out how to get together. Of course, right now we always have a venue because Zoom is for everybody.
Zoom. Yeah, and that's, yeah, I think it's for everybody, and the ability for people of color to be in spaces to create platforms at these venues. So my biggest objective is the relationships I build is to help artists have a platform for, affordable prices, or to maybe do things they couldn't do on their own, or maybe it's buying their show and bringing it in because it's a good show. So that's really my focus. I am really, really big on paying artists and giving them a spot. So I'm like, hey, you got one woman show? Let me read it. Let me see if it's something the city will let me do. I can't do everything, but let me see, because it's so important for those of us who have platforms and those of us who have spaces to make it readily available for those of us who do not. And that's how we become better.
Absolutely. And that's also, again, arts and activism, how they're related, right? How they're very much
Absolutely.
each other, right? Because I'm definitely always bringing people with me everywhere I get invited to go. I'm like, oh, would you? I was asked by one of the theater companies in the Denver Center for Performing Arts a few years ago to write a one-woman show, and I said, or I could write a 7-woman show with the homies, and that's what we're gonna do. I'm bringing them all. That's what we did, and it was a beautiful show. Very much.
Where that script at? I'm looking for it.
It was a good show. It was a beautiful show. We co-wrote it, co-performed it. It was a very, very collective experience. We ended the show really with 5 performers, director, but it was a really beautiful experience.
Awesome.
And that was 2016. And since then I've written another play, right? But it's been interesting to kind of stretch beyond. That's why I kind of use the title more artist, educator, activist, because our poet is my main jam and that's my main boo, but it's not the only thing that I do.
I totally get it. I find myself growing. So I've grown so much since you first seen me at Wouts. I was so nervous, by the way.
You were amazing.
Thank you. That was my first solo slam ever. It was only my second slam ever. So I was brand new. I was off of I lost a baby like 2 months before Wouts, and I wasn't gonna come, and I decided to come because I needed new air. I'd never been to Dallas, and I was like, I'm gonna go and be around, these people I don't know, to try to breathe different. And when I tell you, Wouts just really blessed my spirit. So I never got a chance to really say thank you, but thank you for your work that you've done, during your time at PSI with that, because that really was a space for healing for me. That was the first time I was really around a lot of women. That was the first time I stood on my own and told my story for myself without teammates. That was the first time so many people were like, I hear you, and I see you. And I remember after I don't know if you remember, you was like, you did great work tonight. And I was like, I was like, me? And, so I really appreciate that. That really, really just lifted my spirits at a time when I was just really down. So thank you for the work that you do that you don't even know you're doing. I didn't even know you did that for me. But I really, really appreciate that. So.
You're telling me that. Sometimes I look back on the slam years and I say, well, that was so wasted. I don't know about it. None of that. I was like,
no. I'm telling you, it really blessed my spirit. And with that being said, I think since we're talking about slam and poems, this is a perfect time to take a look at another one of your pieces. So enjoy.
I've been really trying, baby, trying to hold back this feeling for so long. And if you feel like I feel, baby, come on. Oh, come on. Janice Hunter was a 17-year-old high school student when 34-year-old Marvin Gaye crooned her open. When you type Janice Hunter into Wikipedia, it forcibly redirects to Marvin Gaye's page. He is, after all, the only reason we know her name. When you Google Janice Hunter, the first result is the headline, Marvin Gaye's wife reveals how he tortured her. She still speaks of loving him. Does she still have a name? Lori Maddox was a 15-year-old virgin when 27-year-old David Bowie groomed her wide open for Jimmy Page to follow, and then Mick Jagger, who sang to her of wild horses. And of course, young girls are Mustangs, from the Spanish mustengo, meaning ownerless beast. Mustangs have no natural predators but the men who catch and break them. Childhood living easy to do. To break a wild horse, first you must gain its trust. Sing to it, call it pretty. Get the reins on quickly, wild beasts must be controlled from the head. Give it a new name, something easy for you to say like baby. She will forget she ever owned the wind. I was 13 the first time a man boy tried to tell me he loved me. He was 20. I pretended not to hear him and hung up. I was 15 the second time a man boy tried to tell me he loved me. He was 20. I pretended not to hear him and hung up. I was 16 when the third man boy tried to tell me he loved me. He was much older than 20. I pretended not to hear him and hung up. And how they loved me. Called me muse, watching me playful in open fields. Fame makes a man take things over. Called me quiet, teasing with handfuls of oats. Fame, what you want is in the limo. Called me beautiful until I stopped kicking. Called me theirs, called it love. Is it any wonder? Say, there's nothing wrong with me loving you. There's nothing wrong with me loving you. There's nothing wrong with me loving you. Say it like a mantra until it feels true, until the saddle feels like skin, until the yoke feels like religion. There's nothing wrong with me loving you. Does love mean to lasso a feral mare? Does love ride bareback and call itself quick? Does love mean to harness the thunder in my hips until it all feels yours? The first time I told a man I loved him, I coughed up a rusted chain and a collar, traced it with my tongue, and found my own name already engraved there, just below my mother's. And wild, wild horses, we'll ride them someday.
So we are winding down here. I think we have about one more question for you. It's always a question I like to ask. How has the arts helped create the woman you are today? How has it contributed to, I know you already talking about your family and how it is deeply rooted. How has it gotten you through times and gotten you where you are? I mean, you do it for a career, so how is that?
Yeah, it's definitely inseparable. I think it's for me. If I'm not creating, if I'm not writing, then I'm not well, right? Something's wrong. We got to check on me. I'm not okay. So it's part of my own processing. There was a time I did work in the corporate world for about 10 years.
Okay.
I had a corporate job as an account executive, single mom making choices, had to make it happen. And then as my career as a poet started building more and more, I was trying to compromise and do all of the things all of the time. And I worked myself into a lot of illness. And so I became so sick. I was doing my 9-to-5 corporate gig. And then it was not at all uncommon for me to go to work, hop on a plane, head to the airport, hop on a plane, go do a show, and then get the red eye back and be back at work the next day, right? I'd come back super late, pick up my baby from my grandmother's house, get her home, get her to school in the morning, go back to work, and that was just something that would happen with fair amount of regularity until, obviously my body broke and said no. And so I don't think I ever would have made the choice. I think making that leap into full-time art was scary, especially when you have someone rely on you. But my body just broke. And I remember being at work one day and I was very, very sick, very weak. I'd been going to a lot of doctors trying to figure out what's going on. But I was walking back to my desk from the copier and my legs just gave out from underneath me. And I army crawled my way back to my desk, and pulled myself up and they, people rush over like, are you okay? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm good. Your legs give out.
Just army crawling in the middle of the day.
I mean, sometimes legs don't want to work. I don't know. I'm good though. At which point human resources said, hey, we're going to need you to go home because it's not safe and we don't want to be liable for an injury. So you go home and you come back when you're well. And then I just wasn't well for about a year. And the only thing that I was really able to do with any regularity was write poetry. And even that was challenging for a few months because I just wasn't well at all. So writing was the only thing I could do, and occasionally performing, right? I still had to cancel a lot of shows, but because my health was so challenged, I couldn't do anything with consistency. And so then it was like, well, let me try to do whatever I can do. And that was something that I could still do.
I was 13 years old. My hair no longer listened. I wanted to touch everything that I could not reach. Everyone was growing up wild and dandelion. I, saguaro, was only inching. I prayed for boobs. I wanted to boil.
That became like, all right, well, I guess we're gonna lean all the way into this. And I have not had a corporate job since. And it's been all kind of built out of that. So then been teaching a lot for the last many years. And now I teach a whole lot, all the way from middle school up through graduate school. And I teach also folks who are incarcerated in Colorado, and all kinds of different teaching that I do with a lot of different populations. So that's a lot. And I still write poems and 2 new books this year. So that's been really
Wow, that's so awesome. A lot of similarities. I work with prison population here, program called Free on the Inside. I love working with those guys. I gotta tell you, by far, the most respectful audience I have is inside of a prison.
Easy. Yeah.
Easy.
Look,
Easy.
the middle schoolers are way harder than
Way harder. I have 6th to 8th graders right now for about 8 weeks, and I'm like, whoo.
Well, you put in that work.
Yes. So I definitely understand that in terms of what you're saying. Sometimes it is the only thing we have. It literally becomes probably the soundtrack of our lives, the art that we do. At some point, you can relate where you were with, like you said, your favorite song or that poem you were. For me, again, it was, I remember, my situation because I remember doing the poem about it on final stage at WOW. And I was like, I remember after I was done, I was just like, okay, I think I can do this. I think I can make it. I think I can get better if I just give it time, if I keep writing and keep creating and recreating who I am through the journey, through the pain, through the stuff.
That's also, why humans go to art and to poetry, especially a lot of times, right? Is in those times of questions and those times of grief and all of those times that we need to know that we're not the only people that feel the way we feel. And then you go into these books and you go into these slams and you go into these videos and you find what you can to see, oh, wait, someone else has felt like this. And we create it for the same reason, right? There's so much, my nature is very, very shy. And if it weren't for people all along the way saying, oh, when you said this thing, I really felt that. And then I realized it's my responsibility to say this thing. The fact that I'm terrified. I was reading with shaking paper in my hands for years. I'd be, 15 years old, like, oh, I'm going to say this thing. And I was that way till I was a good 22. So I said, well, I guess this is what I do. And it doesn't matter whether I'm shy. It doesn't matter whether I'm afraid.
Doesn't matter.
What I do is
this
what I
is
have
what
to
I do. These are the blended conversations that we create. We are the conversation starters. And, I've moved a bit outside of poetry, like you said. Performing is kind of, if I perform, I perform. But I create so much now. I'm like, okay, how can I challenge myself? So now I'm stretching myself in the theater world. Well, pre-COVID, I was supposed to kill the theater world 2020, but we're gonna move that along to 2022. So, I'm stretching myself in theater and creating arts education and different things from the arts that I'm like, what else can I use the arts for? Oh, well, I don't know. What about equity and diversity training? What else can you use the arts for? You can literally just translate it into anything you can imagine the arts can do for you.
Yes. And also if the arts are not there, then it's incomplete. It's not a full conversation, right?
At least for me.
Right. We have to, I think that about that all the time, right? When we think about movements, even like, when we think about any kind of organizing, any kind of like activism, any kind of movement, right? If it doesn't engage the heart, then it's not going to be a sustainable movement, right? And so if it's not, I was at a talk once with Sonia Sanchez talking. She said, if it's not rooted in love, it's not sustainable, right? And it's so true. Like we can start out with rage and we can start out with so much anger and so many things. We can be driven by fear. A lot of different things might get something started. And rage is a wonderful beginner, right? It's a
Oh,
wonderful
yes.
start. But it's also not sustainable, right? Eventually rage has to just start, it starts to fizzle out, right? And that's why we saw this over this past summer, right? Like all of a sudden, everybody was like, abolish the police, like, for like 5 hot minutes. And then they were like, well, I mean, what I meant was, we good? All right, we're good. It's not, because rage is not sustainable. It has to be rooted in something more. It has to be rooted in something foundational, and love is foundational. Love is something that can give it a home and let it continue to build and grow. So if it's not rooted in love, we really can't keep it. But there's still a lot of use for rage. I'm very pro rage, but we just got to in a way that is, you got to get that fire started, and then you got to foster it. With love.
I totally understand that. Let's take a look at your last performance here.
Just before high school, I was sent to live in the suburbs with my mother and stepfather, and it was my first time experiencing what felt like a monoculture. The people there were not only all mostly the same race, but they dressed alike and talked alike and listened to the same music and watched the same television shows, and even their houses looked the same. And then there was me and all the questions about what I am. And eventually I learned to respond to all of these questions in poetry. During senior year of high school, a boy that I grew up with was shot at a local shopping mall. The next day at school, a girl I had never spoken to approached me, concern in her brow, asking sweetly, "How's your friend?" I was moved by her empathy. An exotic bird in a beige land of suburban tract houses, I answered, "He's still in critical condition, but we're all praying. My grandmother is down at the hospital now." She, head bobbing hair flip, smile shifting into quiet knife, replied, "Well, I still say if he was a gang member, he deserved to get shot." This poem is for Michelle Albright and what we deserve. You deserved both of my hands around your throat that day and the shaking I gave you. You probably still live in some suburb somewhere in a house just like the one you grew up in. You are probably married to an insurance agent who played high school ball and still reminisces when he drinks too much on the weekends. You are probably a banker, one of those predatory mortgage lenders that gets rich by manipulating poor people. You probably have 2 kids who look exactly like you. You probably think that they deserve the best. Michelle, you never knew Cedric. Never saw the bruises he or his sister wore to Sunday school. Never tried not to fall asleep in the all-night prayer sessions the adults in our families held in hopes of protecting them from their stepfather. Never prayed for him to get saved. You never curled inside the kindness of their mother. Never grew roots in the forest of her song. You did not come to our reunions or revivals, never heard the desperation in our melody. You have never been unable to afford the arrogance of your godlessness, Michelle. You never saw Cedric smile. You never tried to beat him in a foot race. You never wept or prayed for him. You never knew why his manhood was so urgent or why it cost him so much blood to achieve. Michelle, I want you to know that he did survive, and that when he recovered, he reclaimed his manhood the only way he knew how. That he was 17 when they locked him away for good, and the last time I saw him was at his mother's funeral. We were 18 then. They did not unshackle his hands nor his feet as he rattled to the pulpit to read a poem he had written for his dead mother, and all I could think about was you and what you said he deserved, Michelle. I still see his aunties and uncles and cousins sometimes. He is his family's phantom limb, but I know better than to stare or talk about it. My family has missing teeth of its own, Michelle. I am a mother now, and every night when I listen at my daughter's door, I can tell through the door the difference between asleep breathing, awake breathing, and awake pretending to be asleep breathing. I have kissed her head and toes, cleaned her messes, read her books, wrote her lullabies, taught her to ride a bicycle and to swim, helped with homework, talked down teachers, spoken to the mothers of bullies, spoken to bullies, prayed and prayed and prayed. Michelle, I taught her to read. I taught her to speak up, even to me. I have washed and matched her socks over and over again. I've had to send her out into a world that does not value her life, that would tell her something about inferiority and it belonging to her, about her body and identity and it belonging to them, that pretends that Black lives are not as carefully cultivated as white lives, as if she is not the most loved child that has ever lived. Michelle, I wonder what you think she deserves. Michelle, I know Cedric's mother felt the same way about her son that I do about my daughter. Michelle, what do you teach your babies? Michelle, do you know what a victim is? Do you think they always look like you? Michelle, have you ever felt like a statistic? Michelle, do you know they make whole juries just like you? Michelle, do you know the smack of a gavel can crack a spirit in half? Michelle, do you have a spirit? Michelle, we all deserve better than this. Even you.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I just totally enjoyed this conversation. I love Blended. It just allows me to talk to you guys just really candidly and just to get to know you. I mean, to learn stuff about you that I would never know. And I always enjoy it. Tell the people where they can find you on social media.
Oh, they can find me at suziqsmith.com. They can find me at Suzi Q Poet on Twitter, Suzi Q Smith on Instagram. I think is probably all of those things on Facebook. I'm pretty much everywhere you can find people, with the exception of TikTok, because I do feel like I'm too old.
Yeah, I think I've aged out. I can't. Every time I go, I'm like, oh, I'm bored. I'm gonna do it. Nah, I got enough to worry about. So that's kind of where I am with it. You said 2 new books. Just follow you on your social media handles, and we can find out about those and the releases.
Yes, so A Gospel of Bones is out now. That was released on Sunday, actually. And then Poems for the End of the World will be out in June.
Oh, A Gospel of Bones. Got to give me a copy of that. So I guess I'll find it on your social media, guys. Follow her, Suzi Q Smith. Thank you guys for joining us. As always, Blended will be back next month. And we thank you for joining us. Peace.
Thank you, Centric.
Thanks, Suzi.